Greetings and welcome to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the American Society of Naval Engineers podcast. I am your host, Stephen Phillips. In this podcast, we talk a little and learn a lot about naval engineering while inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. Today, I'm joined by Dr. John Cordle to discuss Human Systems Integration, or HSI. Dr. Cordle is a 1984 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy with a Bachelor of Science degree in Ocean Engineering with Merit. He has a Master of Science degree in Strategic Planning from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and a Doctorate of Engineering Management with focus in Human Systems Integration from Old Dominion University. Hence our conversation today. He retired in 2013 as Chief of Staff for Commander, Naval Surface Force Atlantic. Naval surface ship command tours included a wartime deployment in command of USS Oscar Austin and a counter-piracy deployment in command of USS San Jacinto. He was the 2010 recipient of the U.S. Navy League's Captain John Paul Jones Award for Inspirational Leadership and the 2010 BUMED Epictus Award for Innovative Leadership for his work in crew endurance and circadian watch rotations. And he was the 2019 U.S. Naval Institute and Surface Navy Author of the Year for his articles on fatigue management, and also the 2019 ASNE Solberg Award for research. He recently retired as the primary advisor to Commander, Naval Surface Force Atlantic on human factors and human performance issues. So, of course, this is just going to be a great conversation. I've been really looking forward to it. So, Dr. Cordle, John, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I really look forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. It's pretty cool to have another Sanjak sailor on the line as well. Awesome.
I always enjoy talking to other Sanjak sailors. There's just something about that ship, right? You know, you just feel a kinship with people who've been on board.
Absolutely.
Let's start with some definitions. How do you define human systems integration, and why is it so critical to fleet readiness and safety today?
Great question. So HSI, or Human Systems Integration, is really, if you boil it down, it's the integration of the human into the design of whatever you're building. So it could be everything from a ship, an airplane, a submarine, a navigation system, an iPhone, a coffee machine. And it's the idea that the human is not a user of the system, but the human is a part of the system. And if you shift that paradigm, then you start to think about systems with the human as an integral piece of it, and not as something that drops in at the end and then tries to figure out how to use it. Does that make sense?
It does indeed. I should say to the audience that a lot of our conversation is based on a presentation that was shared with me. So, sometimes I have authors of books on, and this is a case where I was reading a presentation. And in that, you distinguish between human factors engineering and human systems integration. Could you walk us through those two concepts and how they differ in practice and how they complement one another in ship design and operations?
Sure. The great thing about being a human factors engineer is nobody knows what that is. So you can kind of do whatever you want, call it human factors. And that's kind of what I found is that, so HSI is the overarching definition. Inside of HSI, there's about 7 domains. Things like habitability, survivability, safety, human factors is one. Training, manning, manpower, because really HSI involves all of those domains. And the human factors is one subset. So the human factors piece is if you build that machine and the human is part of it, the machine is kind of designed around a human who is properly trained, well rested, well fed, physically fit, mentally alert. And then human factors comes in as, okay, what if that person is tired, hungry, cold? There's noise in the background, there's vibration, there's been deficit in their training. They're older, or they're short, or they're tall. Something as simple as, can you look out the window? Of the DDGs. The DDGs, we could talk examples later on, but the Arleigh Burke DDG class was designed when it was an all-male force on ships, and so they used the male characteristics to design the height of the windows. And when you brought women on board, that the average woman is quite a bit shorter than the average man and can't see out the windows. So something as simple as that, or something as complex as how do you measure the fatigue of someone over time, and how does that affect their performance? So it's anything that affects that human piece of the machine.
The title of the talk or presentation is A View from the Fleet. What are some of the most striking examples that you have seen of poor or even excellent HSI in action aboard Navy vessels?
Okay. I'm going to back up just 1 second to explain the title a little bit because um, the job that I retired from recently in government service was entitled Human Factors Engineer. It was put in place after the 2017 collisions between the John S. McCain and uh, the Fitzgerald, USS Fitzgerald. Not between the two ships, but the two collisions that happened very close together. And in the resulting investigations, they combined an investigation called the Comprehensive Review, and it looked at HSI and human factors both as part of those investigations and determined that there was a gap at the type commander level of understanding of what that meant. In other words, we were designing systems and fielding them, and we were also manning them with people without understanding the impact of things like fatigue or system design on those people. And so if you're looking for an example of a gap in HSI or human factors, it's those two collisions. If you read that report, and I highly recommend any member of ASNE should go back and reread those reports. Um, there was one common factor, which was inadequate training and fatigue. Well, actually, two things were sort of common to both ships. Fatigue induced by high level of operations and a watch rotation that was non-circadian that we could talk about later. But also on the case of the McCain, the design of the steering system was sort of after the fact discovered to be pretty inadequate from a human usage point. Just to put a fine point on it, the system actually worked exactly as it was supposed to. But on the bridge of the ship that night, you had the helmsman, the lee helmsman, the officer of the deck, and the captain, and they could not figure out how to drive the ship with this system. And so, to me, that is a fundamental flaw, and that's probably the most egregious case of system design HSI failure that I can see. Um, as far as successes, in the presentation we talked about a few, like the bridge lighting system that we put in place, the fatigue management program that came out of that. So there are successes. The Aegis weapon system is a great example of a very successful HSI. Some lessons learned, obviously, like the Vincennes and event and things like that. But sort of building that human into the decision tree, I think that's probably from my experience from a Navy system, the Aegis weapon system is probably the most HSI success that I can think of in my experience.
How is the human thought of as a subsystem within the overall platform?
Well, I think the almost every system that you use, whether it's the individual, the radar, the navigation system, the engines, the steering system, the weapon system, there's a human interaction somewhere, right? Whether it's the button on the Aegis system that's the last thing before you launch a missile, or whether it's the interaction with the steering wheel or the throttle on the lever, and then looking at the display. And so at every junction where you have human interaction, the HSI has basically a protocol for going, okay, what's the best way to design this system using interaction with actual humans, using modeling to design the system so that it's easy to use and doesn't require a lot of training. When you go through the HSI training, there's kind of a chart that shows the trade-off between a system design and training. I pull my iPhone out of the box and I can use it because I don't. It's so well designed. I don't need training. And then we build a system like this IBNS system, the integrated bridge system on the McCain, where it takes 7, 8, 10 weeks to learn the system uh, because you're overcoming some of the design challenges that were built into it. I don't know if that answered your question, but somewhere
Yeah,
tangentially, I think.
indeed, indeed, I'm tracking. You cite the GAO's recommendation to use wearable technology to address sailor fatigue. I found this fascinating. We've all stood watches for long hours on end in between
Sure.
evolutions and been exhausted, right? So how do you see technologies like the Oura rings? Is that how you pronounce it? Oura?
Or, uh-huh. Yeah.
Aura rings and the watch bill optimization changing the Navy's approach to crew endurance and safety.
Yeah, so this for me was sort of my bread and butter. It was sort of my why. Like you, I stood watching crazy rotations and shift work, and was asleep on my feet, kind of snuggle up between the radar and the window, trying to stay awake on the mid watch. And then it was during my tour on San Jacinto that I discovered that there's science behind this that says, hey, if I stand a circadian watch, in other words, stand the same watch every day, work the same hours, and then sleep at the same time, even if you're sleeping as much as I am, but you're sleeping at different hours, and I'm sure you live like a five and dimes rotation, 5 on, 10 off, where one day is 24 hours long and you sleep for 6 hours and you work another 18-hour day, but you're always sleeping at different times. Um, that you end up in a state of fatigue that's a lot more tired than I am because I'm sleeping at the same time. So that became something that we worked through. And after the collisions, that became Navy policy. The challenge was it's all self-reporting, right? And if you ask any sailor how much sleep did you get, they'll say, "Oh, I got 8 hours last night." Well, really, what time did you go to bed? Well, midnight. Well, what time did you get up? Well, 6. Well, okay, that's only 6 hours. And oh, by the way, you weren't asleep that whole time. You probably played some video games, watched a movie, and so the Naval Postgraduate School and the Naval Health Research Center came up with a program called Crew Readiness Endurance for Watchstanders, which is essentially it's a computer program that pulls the data from an Oura ring, from a watch. There's a Fitbit type of thing. There's different types of sensors. Um, and if I'm wearing an Oura ring, then I can read it on my phone, but I can also digest that data into a computer that can then display it for me personally, for my watch team, for my division. Um, so you can take the data from the Oura ring or the watch or whatever wearable device, you can ingest it into this computer server called Crew, and then you can fold it into a display so that the captain, the department head, anybody, even back ashore, depending on you have internet connectivity, can look at the fatigue level by watch team, by department, by individual. There's programs that can flag individuals who fall below a threshold of fatigue, so that you could say, "Hey, I'm gonna I'm going to take this person off the watch bill tonight because they're too tired," or "I'm going to substitute and move an evolution because everybody's tired." Right, so we're not going to do that underwear replenishment at 6 in the morning. We're going to do it at 9 in the morning. And so the circadian watch rotation was a sea change. Really, it was a complete revision of the way we looked at the workday, because you had to change the workday completely, from morning quarters to taps to reveille. Some people worked from noon to midnight. They slept during the day. What the watch does, or the Oura Ring does, is now provides you, as I mentioned to one group, as an engineer, you were an engineer for a while, right? Um, you knew the voltage on your bus, you knew the pressure in your oil system, but you never could tell how tired you were except by guessing. Well, now the Oura Ring gives us a measurement that we can get that data, and we can use that data to make adjustments in the routine, adjustments in policy, to make things better. And so, just to close that out, we this research has been going on for a decade, but it really gained momentum in the past 3 or 4 years. Dr. Anita Shattuck at the Postgraduate School, Dr. Rachel Markwald at the NHRC outfitted an entire strike group. The Truman Strike Group went out with about 100 rings per ship, and the last strike group, the Ford Strike Group, went out with almost everyone on those ships had an Oura ring, from the captain to the admiral, some of the maintainers on the carrier. I think they handed out 1,600 rings to the entire strike group. So that data is still being collected. They're on deployment. I think they're still on deployment now. But that's really going to change the dynamic of how we measure and respond to fatigue in the fleet.
It's fascinating. You have alluded to this earlier. So there's something that is going to help those standing bridge watches are special lights to augment their administrative duties while also protecting their night vision. I remember being on the bridge and it was completely, dark. I had a little red lens,
Right.
flashlight that I would use. So tell us about these initiatives.
Sure. So light is a big factor in your wakefulness and fatigue, but it's also when you're trying to look out the window of a bridge, night blindness can be a problem because you're trying to look at a contact who has very dim lights on the horizon. It might be really dark out, and so one of the takeaways from the comprehensive review, and this goes back to those HSI sort of gaps that we talked about, or misses, if you will, There are actually very, very strict specifications for how bright a light can be on the bridge of a ship at night because of night vision, right? Um, we almost never enforced those for years. And so we found out that that little red light on the radio was like 1,000 times brighter than the specification. Um, that the radar screens, as the screens change, you can't dim them down far enough. Or if you dim them down, now you can't read them. Or people would do like you talked about with the red flashlight, or they would put a red screen over it. They'd buy at Walmart like one of those, like a clipboard, tape it over the screen. The problem is now I can't see any of the red stuff, which is where we put warnings and water contours and stuff like that. And so a conglomeration of contractors and government folks up at, of all places, the Naval Undersea Warfare Center up in Newport, put together a series of filters that are they're gray in color, but they're designed to attenuate brightness without attenuating color. And so they built screens sized to the gear. They built basically little tape and buttons you can put over the lights. Some things now are being 3D printed with that material. You can put it right over as a light cover. And so they actually dropped the brightness of the ships by like 75 to 80% at night just by doing this. What you did with duct tape, I'm sure, on Sandjack, right, is now an official policy with actual science behind it. The other, sometimes it's the simplest stuff. Is one of our scientists was measuring, and just for some reason, most ships had the bridge painted kind of a light blue, kind of a reflective, almost glow in the dark, almost color. And one of our engineers said, if you paint it black, it'll drop the light by 90%. And so we did one, and we found fantastic results. And then we literally said, well, let's just tell every ship to paint the bridge black. Um, in a classic HSI fail, we didn't calculate how many man hours that is, and the fact that that's pretty detailed painting for sailors to do. We also miscalculated how much black paint the Navy had because we emptied all the shelves at the Navy Supply Center. But over the last 3 years, now both in-service ships and pre-commissioned ships are being built with a black bridge, which, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's literally night and day, the difference in brightness of a bridge at night that's black versus one that's painted the standard Navy colors. So sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective.
That's fascinating, truly. There's other things that you talk about in the presentation. You discussed ongoing efforts such as mattress studies and rack curtain testing. You talked about circadian lighting earlier. How much of an impact do these relatively small habitability changes have on the overall readiness and retention?
I think it's a double-edged sword because we haven't made a lot of advances in those two areas, despite a lot of effort. So it's hard to measure what could be, but we know that the biggest complaints from sailors in berthings were light and noise and their mattress. Actually, the mattress was number one. I actually had a sailor when I was the reactor officer on the Bush, um, came to spend the night in the Newport News jail for 2 nights over the weekend. And when we talk on the ship later, he said, "Hey, RO, can we get the mattresses that they have in prison because they're better than mine on the ship?" Um, and uh, and so we have overcome some of the bureaucratic hurdles because it have to be flame tested, flame retardant for curtains and mattresses. And HRC has a lab where they have to have a berthing compartment mocked up. And we've actually, I think, finished testing with commercial mattresses with some flame retardant characteristics in the lab, and it was moving to the barge earlier this year. So those types of things can make a huge difference because it's not just the quantity of sleep; it's the quality of sleep. And the mattress and the rack curtains can really cut down on light, noise, and a much more comfortable bedding. Something as simple as changing out for better pillows and mattresses. So one of the things we did in the surface Navy was we mandated that all ships swap out their mattresses every 3 years. It used to be 5, but at 5 years, a mattress is nothing more than kind of a spongy, threadbare thing, and kind of grody sometimes. And so we said, look, the 36-month maintenance or OFRP, cycle, deployment cycle, let's swap out the mattresses at the 3 year point as the ship leaves the yards. So sometimes a policy change, if you can't get the technology there, it takes longer. A policy change can help mitigate that.
Another thing that you mentioned in the presentation is the active ride control system, which
Hmm.
aims to reduce shock by 25%. This is a remarkable improvement on small craft, on the like
Right.
ribs and the like. Could you share more about how this kind of innovation helps us and how it improves human safety, mission effectiveness, etc.?
Sure, sure. I'm sure you rode in a rib at one point.
Indeed, I
You
did.
probably got wet.
I was an EOD guy, and so I ended up spending a
Ah,
lot of time in a rib when I lateral transferred into EOD.
okay, okay. My dad was EOD.
Yeah,
What's the motto? You get all, it's a trial and error occupation. You get all the trial you want and one error.
that's right.
Uh, but
Initial success or total failure.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, and I'm sure you've been tracking a little bit lately as we start to look at things like traumatic brain injury from shock and vibration. It's been a lot in the press with Marines, with howitzers, artillery, and then also with boat operators, special forces in these super fast ribs. When a rib goes along the water, it's so overpowered, it just slams on the waves and it vibrates like crazy. And what we found was people who did that, who drove those boats for a long time, or did their mission in those boats, were retiring and just flooding the VA with disability claims for ankles, legs, thighs, hips, back, and then now TBI. And so we started looking at redesigning the boats, but that's a huge undertaking. And then we found through SBIR, Small Business Initiative, a company who was building for boat racing, like for commercial boat racing. It's an add-on. It's basically two underwater ailerons, about a foot long and 6 inches wide, that have a laptop hooked up with them, and it measures the frequency of the waves as you're going, and it starts to predict and then adjust ahead of time. And what it did was it did two things. It pulled the bow of the boat down. So we're talking about an 11-meter rib or a 7-meter rib, like we have on surface ships, or the special warfare has a pretty fancy 11-meter, 13-meter rib, I think. And so without changing the whole design of the boat, you could put this additional equipment on and radically stabilize it. It didn't bounce. It sort of stayed on the surface of the water instead of bouncing. The bow stayed down, almost flat. When it turns, you could turn a lot quicker. We tragically lost an officer who got bounced out of a rib off of a destroyer several years ago. And we went out with this system installed, tried to recreate that event where the stern came out of the water and the rib really twisted and ejected the young officer. We couldn't replicate it because the stern held tight to the water. And so, as I last summer, we were getting ready. The Naval Special Warfare was testing it, and the folks at NAVC and the small boat had funded a test to verify that that the findings from the original testing were valid on Navy boats, and that we could move forward with a relatively inexpensive installation that could really, really, maybe save lives, but certainly, and you're talking about not just the operators, but the boat themselves, right? It's not good for your boat to bang it up on the water. It's not good for electronic equipment, maintenance, things like that. It's also pretty important for the tactical mission. If somebody has to shoot out of the boat, um, it was, I rode in it several times, and it really was unbelievable. You could turn the system on and off, and it was a complete change. It allowed the operator to really focus on the mission and not on keeping the boat going straight. So that was kind of exciting to work with that and see the response from boat drivers who were like, "I want this now."
John, how we man our ships can have big impact on the workload. I know that minimal manning has had an impact. Can you talk to me a little bit about manning versus the number of watchstanders that are on board ships these days?
Sure, sure. We've come quite a few different rounds in that area. I was actually the force manning officer for a while. I think I complained so much on Sanjak when I went ashore they made me the N1 at Surfland, the force manning. So, and but there's a couple of challenges. First of all, back to HSI. Let's say I have to have a human being in a chair 24/7. Well, first thing I got to figure out is how long can one human being stay alert and awake in that chair. And the sort of standard Navy answer is 8 hours out of 24. So a ship underway, per the OPNAV instruction, is built with a 3-section watch belt. And then you add on maintenance and training and all the other stuff, and you sort of have this calculator that calculates, the And then the standard Navy work week is 67 hours. I always thought that was funny. Recruiting poster: join the Navy, work 67-hour weeks. But that's the input data that goes into that machine. And then out comes the number of people you need to stand the watch and do the maintenance. And in that goes planned maintenance, PMS, training, all that stuff. Then we shifted to a ship, a couple of tries like optimal manning, where we said, okay, we're going to cut that down by 20%, without a lot of analysis into whether or not that would work or not. And what we found was it didn't, and that the workload became excessive, and people were losing out. They still had to stand the hours of watch. They had to fix stuff, but they weren't sleeping, and then they weren't getting the maintenance done. Then we tried things like the Total Combat Ship, where we cut the crew size and put contractors on to do the maintenance. But then we sort of cut the funding for the contractors. So now those ships are back up at almost a standard three section. They started out with, I think, 40 people. Now they're up to 100. Kind of did the same thing again with the Zumwalt class. Started out with 99 people. It's up to like 150, 160. And so we kept relearning those lessons. We tried crew swap, where we kept the hulls overseas and straightened out the crews. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to math. And you can only work so many hours a day and then sleep so many hours a day. And so I had a paper in Naval Engineering Journal a couple of years ago with one of my HSI friends, Dr. Daniel Wallace. We said, if you actually do the math, you can get to four section in the manpower document with only about a 10% increase in the crew, because you strategically plus up the manning in areas where that person's doing maintenance. So if I can go from three section to four section, I buy back 2 hours a day that can be spent on maintenance. And so, you get into some funky math, but it kind of works out. But that was, I tried to staff that around. It was kind of too big of a paradigm shift. But most ships are able to cross qualify and get into four sections now for a good chunk of the crew underway. But no, we discovered a few times, and every time that we try something, it sounds good on paper, when you just apply normal human, frailty to it, humans can only work so many hours in a day, and the workload doesn't change. There's also like a manpower factor in ship age, right? So older ships, as I'm sure you experience on Sanjak, the older they get, the more maintenance there is. And so I think we've learned some of those lessons. The new frigate class, the initial thought was we can man it like the Europeans do, but the Europeans don't do the extended deployments that we do. They don't do a lot of the other sort of non-maritime stuff that sailors do underway. So that ship is back up close to 200 people, I think, in the manning. So that's another big chunk of HSI is doing that analysis up front, so that we're not chasing our tail when it comes to manning and manpower. But to me, that's always been sort of I always have seen a direct line between manning shortages and fatigue. And that's an inconvenient truth, because people are the most expensive part of the ship, but I believe it's true.
I have another definition question. What is designed induced error, and how can it be reduced or removed?
Great question. I think one of the challenges when you're looking at system design and the way the Navy designs systems is you have the designers and the users, and they're very different groups of people, right? The design, I mean, I've been to the different naval laboratories, I've been to NAVC, and you just meet some of the nation's best engineers, systems engineers, analysts, designers, naval architects, all that kind of stuff. But they've never been on ships. They never served on ships. And so they're building the system to the specifications, but they have no idea about the person who's going to use it. And then you have the sailors who get plopped into the system. And I'll never forget one of my favorite quotes was a young helmsman, 18 years old, on a destroyer, who we were just talking at night. I was riding the ship to take some measurements and do some studies. And he goes, sir, I'll tell you what, this steering unit is the most complex thing in my life right now, and I have no idea how it works. And this is the guy steering this billion-dollar warship, and so that design-induced error is when you build into the design something that is so complex or so counterintuitive or just not intuitive that any user who uses that is going to screw it up, is going to make a mistake. And I've seen that a few times. Talk about the IBNS system. There's actually, we wanted to replace these old fashioned wheels and levers where people drive ships and boats with for decades, centuries, with basically an iPad touchscreen. Well, there's actually in the International Maritime Standards documentation, it basically says thou shalt not use touchscreen technology for critical ship control systems. Um, and lo and behold, in the interest of reduced manning, way back when somebody said, well, hey, if we just ignore that prohibition, then we can reduce the manning on the ships by 5% by getting rid of some of these watch standards. And we paid the price, right? And so it was interesting. One of my projects from one of the classes at the PhD course that I took was to describe that exact issue, and I used a Keurig coffee machine as an example. There were a couple buttons on there. I had no idea what they do, but somehow I kept blowing up my coffee. Well, I'm not the lowest common denominator. Well, I might be, but if I can't get a coffee machine to produce a cup of coffee, then maybe there's a design issue with it. Or maybe I'm just an idiot. That's a possibility. But then I saw later that some of those changes had come out. They changed them. So yeah, but it comes to that critical interface between the user and the designer, and we're going to talk later about some of the shortfalls that I saw. That lack of connectivity is probably the biggest one in my mind.
What are the overall HSI challenges that the fleet experiences? And I also should say, you noted that HSI still faces hurdles like fragmented funding and lack of centralized oversight and inconsistent professional certification. So, in your view, what structural change would make the biggest difference right now?
Okay. That's kind of a two-part question, which is my own fault. But to start out with, what I saw in my 5 years in this with HSI working groups, working with all the different entities, because it really is a cross-functional team. You've got folks in the design phase, in the user phase, the testing phase. We have some fantastic facilities up in Philadelphia at the lab there. They have almost an entire ship, built in combat systems and engineering. Dahlgren, Virginia has a human performance lab where they can build a mock-up of a bridge or something like that. A lot of commercial entities have laboratories that can do modeling and things like that. And so we did all that stuff, right? But sometimes there were three things that I found were sort of hurdles to this. Number one, a basic understanding of what HSI is and isn't. You asked me in the beginning, you probably didn't really know, right? Well, a lot of engineers don't understand that it's not an add-on science. It's fundamental to the design. And so getting education in place, Monterey has a certification program for HSI. They used to have a master's, but they did away with it because of there was no demand signal from the fleet. And so DAU has some courses you can take, but they're not mandated. And so you take them if you want to, or if you don't want to. So acquisition professionals, engineering duty officers, I think, could really benefit from educational, at least some introduction to HSI as part of their mandatory pipeline training or continuing education. So understanding HSI was kind of one of the big challenges. The second one was centralized control. So there are HSI professionals scattered throughout the Navy, but they work in different directorates. They work in different. Even Surflight and Surfpac had the HFE in a different code, and so that inhibits collaboration. And then there was not a centralized authority up in NAVC who thinks exclusively about HSI. It's interesting. One of my friends who's in cyber compared it HSI today to cyber 10 years ago. Everybody knew that it was important, but nobody was in charge of it. And then they kind of stood up a cyber command and they built people who that's their specialty, and they built an infrastructure around that. Well, HSI right now is kind of fragmented depending on where you are and where you sit, and who you work for, and so it's almost the human interaction of the individuals is what provides the continuity and the momentum rather than infrastructure that supports it, if that makes sense. And the other piece is funding. And so, a couple of examples for the boat ride that we talked about. The boat happened to be in Hampton Roads, where there's lots of water and engineers and stuff like that. I'm in Hampton Roads, but the HSI person was up in Dahlgren, which is 2.5 hours away. They couldn't get funding to do a 1 day trip to Norfolk to take the readings on the boat. Um, so the guy came down, spent the night at his friend's house, took a day of leave and did the measurements, and then drove back to work the next day. That shouldn't have to happen in a professional organization. I met an engineer up in Dahlgren, I think it was Dahlgren or up in DC, who had never been on a ship. He was designing shipboard systems. Said, "Hey, let's get you down to the waterfront for a week and let you go to a ship or two and talk to sailors." And I bet I had 100 emails between GS-15s across the Navy, probably 10 people on the CC line, trying to get this guy 5 days in Norfolk. Never happened, right? The other piece is that each program is responsible for HSI as a subset of their funding. But as you know, I'm sure from your acquisition, I'm sure you have some acquisition-related experience. What's the first thing that goes out the window? You have to meet schedule, you have to meet budget. So all that people stuff, all that training stuff goes out the window. And so that HSI becomes a check in the block. And I actually had a flag officer at a briefing one time say, "Well, John, I don't need you checking my homework." And I said, "Well, I'd rather help with your homework, Admiral. I actually can come to a better answer and save you time and money if you let me in the door at the beginning rather than show me what you came up with and have me go, well, that doesn't meet the specs for light or the window height or whatever. And so those are the three things: education, centralized control, um, and then funding were kind of the three pieces. Which I'm a nuke, right? So it kind of reminds me of nuclear power. Why was nuclear power successful? Rickover built the C2. He fenced off the experts and he fenced off the funding, and he drove it through. And I think that's the piece that's missing. Um, and then one last piece of the question was, what's the one thing that? So all that stuff is important, but to me, back to that sailor, the 18-year-old sailor, I never saw anything more powerful than the interaction between the engineers and the sailors. We would fly crews from Mayport to Philadelphia to do steering system testing. And in the room, we would have the engineer who designed the system. We would have the person writing the planned maintenance card, the MRC, EOS, CSOS, the operating systems, all in the room. And the sailor would say, I can't read the letters on this upper right part of the screen. And I need to see, the ship's RPM needs to be displayed there. That way I don't have to do math to do it from some code times the pitch times this. And the engineer's like, okay, when you come back tomorrow, I'll recode it and that'll be displayed on the screen. And by doing that iteration, for example, in this new design, because they put the throttles back on after the collisions, we increased the speed of answering a bell, in this case, from 14 seconds from the time the order was given until the bell was answered to 4 seconds in a space of 6 months by just continually running sailors through it and saying, hey, if you move that, if you give me that data, if you make that brighter or move it over to the right side of the screen. And so if I had a magic wand, I would build a fleet and engineer pipeline so that there was funding and a process to get the engineers down to the waterfront on a periodic basis, not just one time, and get the sailors up to the labs, because the sailors were just blown away at the capabilities that exist. They just had no idea. But the paradigm shift that, hey, I'm going to send my back to the manning piece. I'm in the yards. I'm at 75% manning. I don't have a lot of sailors to send up to Philly for a week to test out a steering system that I'm not even going to get, right? Until maybe three maintenance periods down the road. So that understanding that I'm not the one who's going to benefit from this, right? Ian Smith flying up there. But when I come back as a chief, my sailors will have a better system because I invested the time up front. And the sailors are ready. They're there, right? They don't have to be convinced. It's the leadership. The captain who says, I can't spare Johnny for a week. The GS-15 that says, well, I can't pay for the sailors to fly up there. or for the engineers to fly down. Um, to me, that was kind of that. I hate to use the term frozen middle, but we just we haven't done that before. I'm like, well, that's the problem, right? So that would be sort of my one change that I would be, and that's what ASNE does, right? I mean, not I'm allowed to say ASNE on this uh, podcast. When I go to an ASNE event, who's there? The engineers, the sailors, the type commander folks. So to me, that's the core of the problem and the solution is that interaction.
John, in your closing, you emphasized passion, persistence, and patience, noting that culture change takes a generation. What gives you hope that the Navy's on the right track in valuing the human element as much as hardware?
Uh, I think what really gives me the hope is the sailors, right? And the engineers that I worked with. Once a week, we had a coordination call between the bridge integration team. It was the people who design the systems, the ones that test them, the ones that operate them. A lot of times we had a ship's captain on there, and we would talk through these issues. And there was a process in place, and there is a process in place to say, okay, we have the system out there. How's it performing? What can be improved? And then who is responsible for improving it? And so I saw that work in steering. I saw it work in navigation. Um, the idea of agile design, right? Build a little, test a little, kind of the Aegis thing. Um, we have the experts in place. Well, I'll put a caveat on that, and you can cut this out if you want. But um, earlier this year, when the government started this path of efficiency and delayed retirement program and things like that, one of the areas that took a biggest hit was science and technology and researchers and human factors engineers. So the Navy created billets for, I think, 15 human factors engineers across all the type commanders. I think at the moment, way less than half, I think one third of those billets are actually encumbered with someone doing the work. Surfland and Surfpac did not have anyone. Both human factors are gapped. There's no the hiring process is very arduous now. The environment is challenging, and so what I am seeing is you can have a great structure there, but if the people aren't there to execute it, it doesn't survive. And so this last 6 months has really knocked the wind out of my sails as far as my hopefulness um, that the goodness that we spent 5 years building after those collisions will survive the next 2 years or so because the people just aren't there. The older, tons of folk that you saw it took the DRP, so we lost that 55 and up crowd who had the experience, who would mentor. We also lost the probationary folks who were there less than a year, who had that fire in their belly and that desire to do good work. And so it's like a double whammy. So the good news is it's still going on. The sailors are still engaged. The processes are there. I didn't even mention it, but the training side of the house, the Navy has built these incredible trainers, the maritime trainers in Norfolk, San Diego, Rhoda, Mayport, who really ramped them. I mean, I've never seen a full system of systems, the training, the simulators, the instructors. It's the best, right? Um, and so that's there. That's there. The crew endurance. The last brief I gave at Surfland, the Avila, when can I get more Aura rings to put on the next ships? So I think the culture has changed. They know what they want, um, but is there enough energy in the system to keep it self-sustaining? That's kind of my worry.
I have one last question. If you
Sure.
could see one major HSI success story realized in the next decade, whether it's policy, technology, cultural adoption, what would it be and why?
Okay. Um, I think I kind of touched on that answer a little bit, but I'll put a finer point on it. Um, there's a lot of great individual system answers to that question, right? Uh, a better steering system, a better machinery control system, a better radar. I I worked with the group called Spears, like an IR. I call it like a camera meets a radar meets a computer, where you can almost do everything you can with a radar with visual, right? There's technologies out there that are just incredible. Um, but the way you get those technologies from an HSI perspective is to go back to that linkage between the sailor and the fleet and the engineering community. And so if I had to pick one sort of Zen-like solution, I would build that bridge between, sort of a psychological bridge between the waterfront and just a few places: Dahlgren, Virginia, um, Philadelphia, Newport, Rhode Island, Panama City, some of the centers of excellence, and then of course all the different defense contractors that support those government entities, so that we're all collaborating and not competing with each other, and that those sailors are integral policy. So you never have a sailor again look at a 60-year-old engineer and say, "I don't know how this system works, and yet I'm PQS qualified to operate it." To me, that would be the nirvana. And it's all doable, right? There's not a single person in the system that doesn't want that to happen. But I think we have to bust some paradigms. I'm actually a little bit encouraged by some of the verbiage coming out of re-engineering the acquisition system. As long as that includes sailor feedback, then I think we're all on the right path.
I said that was the last question, John, but is there anything else that you would like to share with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience before we close?
Sure. I'd like to go back to something that I kept on the wall of my little printout in my cubicle for the entire 5 years. One was it was actually an article that I wrote called "Fatigue is the Navy's Black Lung Disease," where there was a picture of a sailor who is tired and but being in firefighting gear, but her face shows both desperation and determination, and so it reminded me that that sailor is why I'm coming to work every day. And I told you the quote about the most complex system, I don't know how to work it. I also had a sailor tell me that I wake up every morning and I have to choose between one more precious hour of sleep and breakfast. And I hope sailors don't have to make that choice either. But there's a great quote in the comprehensive review where one of the findings was, if the system, if conducting sufficient fleet testing on a system is too time consuming or too expensive, then that system should not be installed on a Navy vessel. And so that was the little quote I had hanging over my door. And I think that goes back to all the stuff that we've talked about here: is you can cut this stuff out, but you're going to pay at the back end. And so those were the two things that I kept on my sort of tape to my cubicle to remind me of the importance of this work. But no, thank you for the opportunity.
Indeed, and thank you for sharing that. That's really inspirational. And so thank you, Dr. John Cordle, for taking this time to discuss human systems integration, HSI. I hope that we can welcome you back again to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the podcast of the American Society of Naval Engineers.